The fluorescent lights of Phoenix Grace Hospital gleamed off its polished floors and sleek glass walls, giving the place an air of sterile perfection. Everything about the hospital radiated wealth and modernity, state-of-the-art equipment, meticulously maintained decor, and a calm yet impersonal hum of efficiency. Yet to Rosa Carter, it felt cold. The kind of cold that came not from the air conditioning, but from an invisible barrier, an unspoken exclusivity. Rosa stepped through the employee entrance, her heart beating faster than she wanted to admit. She clutched her clipboard, a steadying anchor for her trembling hands. Her dark blue nurse uniform was freshly pressed, her black hair tied back neatly into a ponytail. She had spent hours preparing for this moment, making sure every detail was perfect. This was her first day, her first opportunity to prove she belonged here. She adjusted her badge, Rosa Carter RN, and looked around the employee hallway. It was quiet, almost too quiet, as though the world had held its breath. As she walked, the soft squeak of her shoes on the pristine floor echoed against the walls, amplifying the loneliness of the space. At the far end of the hall, a cluster of staff gathered near the nurses' station. Laughter and casual conversation filled the air. Rosa's lips curved into a small smile as she approached, hoping to introduce herself. But the moment they noticed her presence, the laughter stopped. Conversations faded into whispers. Eyes turned to her, scanning her from head to toe. Some of the gazes were curious, others indifferent, but a few were unmistakably guarded. "Good morning," Rosa greeted warmly, though her voice wavered slightly. She straightened her shoulders, trying to project confidence. A tall nurse with blonde hair and piercing blue eyes stepped forward. Her expression was polite, but her tone carried an icy edge. "Can I help you?" "Yes, I'm Rosa Carter," she replied, forcing a smile. "I'm the new nurse starting today." The woman's eyes flickered briefly, surprise perhaps, or something else less easy to read. "The head nurse's office is down the hall, second door on the left," she said, her words clipped. "Thank you," Rosa said softly. But the woman had already turned back to the group, her dismissal as clear as her words. As Rosa made her way to the office, she couldn't help but notice the quiet murmur that followed her. It was subtle, barely audible, but she felt it, like a shadow trailing her every step. For a moment, self-doubt threatened to creep in, whispering that maybe she didn't belong here. But Rosa squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. She had faced challenges before and overcome them. Today would be no different. She reached the head nurse's office and knocked, each tap a silent affirmation to herself. This was her chance to prove what she was made of. Whatever doubts lingered behind those cold stares, Rosa was determined to show them the nurse she truly was. The break room was modest but functional, with a few worn chairs surrounding a central table and lockers lining one wall. A coffee machine hummed softly in the corner, filling the air with the faint aroma of brewing coffee. Rosa stepped inside, clutching her clipboard against her chest like a shield. A cluster of nurses were chatting near the lockers, their laughter light and easy. As soon as Rosa entered, the conversation halted. Heads turned, and once again, eyes scanned her as if assessing a stranger trespassing into their space. She offered a polite smile and a small wave. "Hi, I'm Rosa Carter," she said, trying to sound confident despite the lump forming in her throat. "I'm the new nurse starting today." The silence that followed was deafening. One of the nurses, a brunette with her hair neatly tied in a bun, offered a thin smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Welcome," the woman said flatly, then turned back to the others. Their conversation resumed in hushed tones, the words too soft for Rosa to make out. Rosa stood awkwardly for a moment, the warmth she had hoped to feel replaced by an unrelenting chill. She decided to grab a cup of coffee, if only to give her hands something to do. As she reached for a mug, an older nurse with streaks of gray in her hair stepped forward. Her name tag read Lily. "First day, huh?" Lily said, her tone somewhere between curiosity and caution. She crossed her arms, looking Rosa up and down. "Yes," Rosa replied, managing a smile. "I'm excited to get started." Lily let out a dry chuckle. "Excitement doesn't last long around here. This place isn't exactly welcoming, especially for people like you." Rosa stiffened, her smile faltering. "People like me?" Lily leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. "You'll see soon enough. Let me give you some advice. Keep your head down and do your job. Don't expect anyone to roll out the red carpet." Rosa swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. Lily's words weren't overtly hostile, but they carried a weight that pressed down on her like a warning. "I'll do my best," Rosa said finally, her voice quieter now. Lily gave a curt nod before stepping back. Rosa took her coffee and retreated to a corner of the room, trying to process the interaction. Around her, the chatter continued as though she weren't even there. She had hoped for camaraderie, a shared sense of purpose, but instead found herself feeling like an outsider looking in. Rosa sipped her coffee slowly, letting its warmth steady her. Lily's words lingered, a bitter truth wrapped in unsolicited advice. This was not going to be easy. Rosa stepped into room 312, her clipboard clutched tightly in her hands. The patient, John Mitchell, was a man in his late 70s with a stern expression etched into his weathered face. He sat upright in the hospital bed, arms crossed over his chest, his piercing eyes narrowing as soon as Rosa entered. "Who are you?" he barked, his tone sharp and unwelcoming. Rosa forced a professional smile. "Good morning, Mr. Mitchell. I'm Nurse Carter, and I'll be taking care of you today." Mr. Mitchell's frown deepened. "No, you won't," he snapped. "I want someone else, someone better suited." Rosa's smile wavered, but she held her ground. "I assure you, Mr. Mitchell, I'm fully qualified to provide your care," she replied calmly, her voice steady despite the sting of his words. He scowled, leaning forward slightly. "Qualified, huh? We'll see about that. I've been in and out of hospitals long enough to know who's good and who's not." Rosa nodded, her hands tightening on her clipboard. "I understand, sir. Let's start with checking your vitals." As she moved closer to his bedside, Mr. Mitchell muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. "They're letting anyone in these days. Standards sure aren't what they used to be." The words hit her like a slap, but Rosa kept her expression neutral. Years of practice had taught her to steel herself against such remarks, even as they left invisible bruises. She focused on the task at hand, slipping the blood pressure cuff onto his arm. "This might feel a little tight," she said, her tone gentle and professional. Mr. Mitchell didn't respond, his silence as heavy as his earlier remarks. Rosa worked quickly but meticulously, documenting his readings and adjusting his IV with the same care she gave every patient. Despite his hostility, she refused to let her standards falter. When she adjusted his blanket, he jerked it away from her hands. "I don't need help with that," he snapped. "I understand," Rosa said softly, stepping back to give him space. She met his gaze, her own eyes calm but unwavering. "If there's anything you need, please let me know." He snorted. "What I need is someone who knows what they're doing." Rosa hesitated for a moment before replying, her voice steady but firm. "Mr. Mitchell, my goal is to provide you with the best care possible. If there's something specific I can do to make you more comfortable, please don't hesitate to tell me." For a brief moment, his eyes softened, as though her calm demeanor had caught him off guard. But the scowl quickly returned, and he muttered, "Just get it done." Rosa finished her tasks and gathered her equipment. As she left the room, her chest felt tight, a mix of frustration and sadness. She had encountered difficult patients before, but the combination of blatant hostility and quiet prejudice was a bitter pill to swallow. In the hallway, she paused, taking a deep breath. The words of her mother echoed in her mind. "You're going to have to fight twice as hard, baby girl, but don't ever let them see you break." With those words as her anchor, Rosa straightened her back and moved to her next assignment. She was here to do her job, and she wouldn't let anyone or their prejudices stop her. The conference room was spacious, with a long glass table surrounded by sleek leather chairs. The morning sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, but the atmosphere inside felt far from warm. Rosa sat near the end of the table, her hands folded neatly in front of her. It was her first staff meeting, and she was determined to make a good impression. At the head of the table sat Dr. Carterson, the chief physician. His presence dominated the room, his salt and pepper hair and sharp gray suit exuding authority. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he spoke, his voice tinged with condescension. "As you all know," he began, "our hospital has recently embraced new diversity initiatives. While these are meant to bring in fresh talent, let's ensure we're not compromising the standards that Phoenix Grace is known for." The room fell silent, and the weight of his words hung heavily in the air. Rosa felt her cheeks flush. Though he hadn't named her directly, the implication was clear. Her chest tightened, but she kept her expression neutral. One of the senior nurses chimed in, "Of course, Dr. Carterson. Standards are what keep us at the top." Several others nodded in agreement, their murmurs of assent filling the room like a quiet tide. Rosa gripped the edges of her chair, debating whether to stay silent or speak up. She had worked hard to earn her place here, and she wasn't going to let veiled comments diminish her. Summoning her courage, Rosa cleared her throat. "I believe diversity can strengthen our team," she said, her voice calm but steady. "Bringing in people with different backgrounds and experiences allows us to understand and care for our patients better." Heads turned toward her, some faces unreadable, others tinged with mild surprise. For a brief moment, Rosa thought she had managed to cut through the tension. But before she could continue, Dr. Carterson raised a hand, silencing her mid-sentence. "Thank you, Nurse Carter," he said curtly, not even looking in her direction. "But let's stay focused on operational priorities for now." The dismissal stung. Rosa sank back into her chair, biting the inside of her cheek to keep her composure. Around her, the conversation shifted back to other topics as though she had never spoken. As the meeting wore on, Rosa's thoughts churned. She wasn't naive. She had expected challenges. But the overt dismissal of her voice, coupled with the subtle yet cutting comments, made the walls of the room feel closer, the air heavier. When the meeting adjourned, Rosa gathered her notes and walked out quickly, her head held high despite the lump in her throat. She reminded herself again of her purpose, of the patients who needed her, and of the resilience that had carried her this far. But as she stepped into the hallway, she couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that, no matter how hard she tried, breaking through these walls would be a battle fought inch by inch. Rosa sat alone in the break room during her lunch hour, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. She absent-mindedly poked at her salad, her appetite dulled by the weight of the morning staff meeting. The room, usually filled with chatter, was empty, leaving her with only her thoughts for company. As she pushed her plate aside, the door creaked open, and a woman stepped in. She was petite, with auburn hair tied in a loose bun and a hesitant smile that immediately made her seem approachable. Her name tag read, Emily Harper. "Mind if I sit here?" Emily asked, holding up a tray with a sandwich and coffee. Rosa shook her head, gesturing to the seat across from her. "Not at all." Emily settled into the chair and took a sip of her coffee, her eyes scanning Rosa's face. "You're the new nurse, right, Rosa?" "That's me," Rosa said with a small smile. "And you're Emily, I think?" Emily nodded. "Started about 2 months ago. Still trying to figure out where I fit in around here." Rosa's smile widened slightly, a flicker of camaraderie sparking between them. "Let me guess, you also got the silent treatment your first week?" Emily let out a soft laugh, though there was a hint of bitterness in it. "Oh, it's not just the first week. I've been feeling like an outsider since day one. You?" Rosa hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, something like that. I keep telling myself it'll get better, but..." She trailed off, unsure how much to share. Emily leaned forward, lowering her voice as if they were exchanging a secret. "Let me guess. Dr. Carterson?" Rosa blinked, caught off guard. "You've noticed?" "Hard not to," Emily said, rolling her eyes. "He's got this way of making you feel 2 inches tall with just one look. And if you're not part of his inner circle, good luck getting a word in." Rosa chuckled softly, the tension in her chest easing for the first time all day. "Well, that makes 2 of us then." Emily smiled, her expression warm and genuine. "You know, it's kind of nice having someone to talk to about this. I was starting to feel like I was the only one." Rosa nodded. "Me too. It's isolating, isn't it? Feeling like no matter how hard you try, you're always on the outside looking in." Emily's eyes softened, and she reached across the table, her hand resting briefly on Rosa's. "It doesn't have to stay that way. Maybe we can look out for each other. Strength in numbers, right?" A lump formed in Rosa's throat, but this time it wasn't from frustration. It was from the simple relief of being seen, of finding an ally in a place that had felt so cold. "Strength in numbers," Rosa echoed, her smile growing. "I'd like that." The 2 women spent the rest of their break sharing stories about their experiences, their frustrations, and their hopes. By the time they left the room, Rosa felt lighter, as though a small crack of light had broken through the wall of isolation she'd been fighting against. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and for now, that was enough. The evening sky outside Rosa's small apartment window was streaked with shades of orange and pink, but she barely noticed. She sat at her kitchen table, her uniform still on, staring at her phone. After a long, deep breath, she dialed a number she knew by heart. It only rang once before her mother's warm, familiar voice came through. "Rosa Mia, how was your first day?" Rosa hesitated, her throat tightening. She had wanted to sound upbeat, to reassure her mother that everything was fine, but the weight of the day pressed too heavily on her shoulders. "It was hard," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. There was a pause on the other end, then her mother's tone softened. "Tell me what happened, Cariño." Rosa leaned back in her chair, the words spilling out before she could stop them. She described the cold stares, the dismissive comments, and how isolated she felt. She told her mother about the staff meeting where she had been silenced, and the patient who had looked at her like she didn't belong. By the time she finished, her eyes stung with unshed tears. "I don't know if I can do this, Mama," she confessed. "It feels like no matter what I do, they've already made up their minds about me." Her mother was silent for a moment, and Rosa could almost picture her on the other end of the line, sitting in her favorite chair with a thoughtful expression. When she finally spoke, her voice was steady and full of the strength Rosa had always admired. "Rosa, listen to me," her mother began. "You didn't get to where you are by giving up. You worked hard, harder than most, and you earned your place there. Don't let anyone make you forget that." Rosa nodded, though her mother couldn't see it. "But it's so exhausting, Mama, always having to prove myself." Her mother's voice grew firmer, a mix of compassion and resolve. "Mija, you are strong. You come from strong women. Remember what I told you? Don't let them see you weak. You hold your head high and show them what you're made of. You're not just there for yourself, Rosa. You're there for every little girl who looks like you and dreams of being in those halls one day." Those words hit Rosa like a surge of warmth, melting the cold knot in her chest. She took a shaky breath, the tears that threatened to fall replaced by a growing determination. "You're right, Mama," she said, her voice steadier now. "I can't give up." "That's my girl," her mother said softly, pride evident in her tone. "And remember, no matter how hard it gets, you're not alone. I'm always here." "Gracias, Mama," Rosa said, a small smile forming on her lips. "I love you." "I love you too, Rosa. Now get some rest. Tomorrow's another day and you've got this." As the call ended, Rosa sat in the quiet of her kitchen, her mother's words echoing in her mind. "You're not just there for yourself." She repeated the phrase like a mantra, letting it fill the spaces where doubt had crept in. With renewed resolve, Rosa stood and began preparing for the next day. It wouldn't be easy, but she had faced challenges before and emerged stronger. This time would be no different. The morning shift at Phoenix Grace was always busy, but today felt like chaos in motion. Nurses bustled down the halls, clipboards in hand, answering call lights, and hurriedly delivering medications. Rosa stood at the nurse's station, reviewing her patient assignments for the day. Her brows furrowed as she scanned the list. There were more names under her care than any of her colleagues. Her heart sank further when her eyes landed on one particular name: Peter Harrison. The name was circled in bold red ink, with a note in the margin: VIP patient, handle with care. "Wow, they're really throwing you into the deep end," a sarcastic voice cut through her focus. Rosa turned to see Claire, one of the senior nurses, smirking as she glanced over Rosa's shoulder. "Peter Harrison, huh? Lucky you. He's a handful." Rosa straightened her shoulders, refusing to let Claire see her frustration. "I can handle it," she replied evenly, though the weight of her workload was already pressing down on her. Claire raised an eyebrow, her smirk widening. "I'm sure you can," she said with mock encouragement. "Just don't mess up. The big wigs aren't going to like it if their VIP isn't happy." A few other nurses within earshot chuckled softly, and Rosa felt the familiar heat of embarrassment creep up her neck. She turned back to her clipboard, determined to ignore them. But the doubts they planted were harder to dismiss. As she headed to begin her rounds, Rosa heard another nurse whisper to Claire, "They really are testing her, aren't they?" "Of course," Claire replied. "Let's see if she can keep up." The words stung, but Rosa forced herself to focus on her tasks. She didn't have time to dwell on their comments, not with the number of patients on her list. She started with the easier cases, moving quickly but carefully, ensuring every detail was documented, every question answered. By the time she reached Mr. Harrison's room, she was already feeling the strain. Taking a deep breath, she knocked softly before entering. The room was larger and more luxurious than the others, with a private sitting area and an impressive view of the city skyline. In the center of it all was Peter Harrison, a silver-haired man in his 60s with an air of authority that filled the room. He sat upright in his bed, his piercing blue eyes narrowing as he watched Rosa approach. "You must be Nurse Carter," he said, his tone clipped and formal. "Took you long enough." Rosa resisted the urge to apologize. "Good morning, Mr. Harrison," she said instead, offering a professional smile. "I'm here to check your vitals and ensure you're comfortable." Peter's eyes flickered over her, assessing. "We'll see how competent you are," he muttered under his breath. Rosa set to work, carefully taking his blood pressure and checking his IV. Peter continued to scrutinize her every move, occasionally letting out a dissatisfied sigh. When she adjusted his pillow, he frowned. "That's too high. Do it again." "Yes, Mr. Harrison," Rosa replied, keeping her tone even. She adjusted the pillow and stepped back, waiting for his approval. For the next 15 minutes, Rosa endured his curt instructions and dismissive remarks, but she refused to let his attitude rattle her. Instead, she focused on her training, maintaining her professionalism and calm demeanor. By the time she left his room, she felt drained but quietly proud. She hadn't let him get to her. As she walked back to the nurse's station, Rosa caught Claire watching her with a smug expression. "Survive your first round with the VIP?" Claire asked, her tone dripping with sarcasm. Rosa met her gaze, her voice steady and firm. "Yes, I did, and now I have more patients to see." Without waiting for a response, Rosa turned on her heel and walked away. Her heart was pounding, but her resolve was stronger. She had a long day ahead, but she wasn't about to let anyone or their doubts slow her down. The operating room buzzed with tense energy as the surgical team prepared for a critical procedure. The overhead lights cast a harsh glow on the sterile environment, reflecting off the gleaming surgical instruments neatly arranged on trays. Rosa stood near the edge of the room, assisting with equipment and monitoring patient vitals. Her presence felt overshadowed by the commanding figure of Dr. Carterson, who led the operation with his usual air of authority. "Scalpel," Dr. Shell Carterson ordered, his voice sharp as he extended a gloved hand. The scrub nurse handed him the tool, and the procedure began. Rosa focused on her role, her eyes darting between the monitors and the movements of the surgical team. The patient's vitals were stable, but Rosa remained alert, her years of training urging her to watch for even the slightest irregularity. Halfway through the procedure, as Dr. Carterson worked to address a complex issue, Rosa's sharp eyes caught something troubling. The incision point was dangerously close to a critical artery. Her breath hitched as she realized that if the doctor proceeded as planned, the artery could be nicked, leading to catastrophic bleeding. Her heart pounded. Should I say something? The thought burned in her mind. Speaking up would be risky. She knew the operating room hierarchy all too well. Challenging Dr. Carterson, especially in front of the entire team, could mean professional backlash, humiliation, or worse. But the patient's life was at stake. Rosa took a deep breath, summoning every ounce of courage she had. "Dr. Carterson," she said, her voice steady despite the tension. "The incision seems close to the carotid artery. Should we reposition slightly to avoid any complications?" The room fell silent. All eyes turned to her, a mix of surprise and unease evident in the team's expressions. Dr. Carterson froze, his gloved hands hovering mid-motion. His head snapped toward Rosa, his gray eyes narrowing. "Excuse me, Nurse Carter?" he said, his tone icy. "Are you questioning my judgment?" Rosa felt the weight of his gaze, the challenge in his words. But she stood her ground. "I'm only pointing out what I've observed, Doctor. It's possible the current angle could pose a risk." A flicker of doubt crossed his face, though his expression quickly hardened. For a moment, Rosa thought he might dismiss her entirely. But then, with a begrudging nod, he shifted his position and adjusted his technique. "Fine," he muttered. "We'll try it your way." The team resumed their work, and Rosa held her breath as the procedure continued. To her relief, the adjustment worked seamlessly, avoiding the potential disaster she had foreseen. The patient's vitals remained stable, and the operation progressed without further complications. When the procedure was over and the patient safely stabilized, the room began to clear. Rosa busied herself with cleaning and organizing equipment, hoping to avoid the inevitable confrontation. "Carter?" Dr. Carterson's voice barked from across the room. She turned to see him glaring at her, his face red with barely contained anger. "Follow me," he demanded, storming out of the operating room without waiting for her response. Rosa hesitated, her pulse quickening. She knew this wasn't going to be pleasant, but she had no choice but to comply. As she stepped into the hallway, she braced herself for whatever was coming next. Despite the looming storm, one thought kept her grounded. She had done the right thing. The patient was alive because she had spoken up, and no amount of intimidation could take that away. The hallway outside the operating room was eerily quiet, the usual hum of hospital activity muted by the tension emanating from Dr. Carterson. Rosa followed him, her stomach twisting with dread. He stopped abruptly near the nurse's station, spinning around to face her. His expression was a storm of fury, his voice cold and cutting. "What were you thinking in there, Nurse Carter?" he snapped, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby staff. Several nurses and junior doctors paused their work, glancing nervously at the scene unfolding before them. "I was doing my job," Rosa replied evenly, though her voice trembled slightly under the weight of his glare. "I noticed something that could have put the patient at risk, and I spoke up." Dr. Carterson's lips curled into a sneer. "Your job," he hissed, "is to follow orders and assist, not to undermine me in front of the entire surgical team." "I wasn't undermining you, Go," Rosa said, her voice firmer now. "I was advocating for the patient's safety." The doctor took a step closer, his tone dripping with disdain. "Let me make something very clear, Nurse Carter. You don't get to question my judgment, ever. Do you understand me?" Rosa met his gaze, her heart pounding. She could feel the weight of every watching eye, the tension crackling in the air. For a moment, she considered backing down, apologizing, doing whatever it took to defuse the situation. But then she thought of the patient lying in recovery, alive because she had spoken up. "With all due respect, Dr. Carterson," Rosa said, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her, "I made the right call, and I would do it again if it meant protecting a patient." Gasps rippled through the small crowd of onlookers. Dr. Carterson's face turned red, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. For a moment, he seemed at a loss for words, his fury bubbling just below the surface. Without another word, he spun on his heel and stormed down the hall, leaving Rosa standing alone in the aftermath. The silence was deafening. Rosa felt the stares of her colleagues, their gazes heavy with judgment, curiosity, and something else, something she couldn't quite name. Claire, the senior nurse who had mocked her earlier, approached with a skeptical expression. "Well, you've got guts. I'll give you that," she said, her tone laced with grudging respect. "Not many people would dare stand up to him, or be stupid enough to try," another nurse muttered under her breath, shooting Rosa a withering look before walking away. Emily appeared at Rosa's side, her face a mixture of worry and admiration. "Are you okay?" she asked softly. Rosa nodded, though her hands were still shaking. "I'll be fine," she said, her voice quieter now. As the crowd dispersed, Rosa realized the dynamic around her was shifting. Some of her colleagues seemed to look at her with newfound respect, while others were colder than ever, their hostility palpable. She had drawn a line in the sand, and the divide was clear. But Rosa wasn't looking for approval. She had made a choice, and she stood by it. Even as doubt crept in, she reminded herself why she was here: to do the right thing, no matter the cost. And today, she had done just that. The soft hum of the monitors filled Peter Harrison's private room as Rosa adjusted the IV line at his bedside. She worked with her usual precision, her focus on the task at hand, though her shoulders sagged slightly under the weight of the day. Peter, propped up comfortably against a mound of pillows, watched her closely, his piercing blue eyes studying her every move. "You're good at this, you know," Peter said, breaking the silence. Rosa glanced up, surprised. It was the first time he had spoken to her without a hint of irritation. "Thank you, Mr. Harrison," she replied, a small smile playing at her lips. Peter chuckled softly. "I don't say that lightly. I've been through my share of hospitals and seen plenty of nurses who either didn't care or didn't know what they were doing. But you're thorough, attentive. You care. Rosa felt a flicker of pride at his words, but it was quickly tempered by the memory of the challenges she had faced. I try my best, she said simply, lowering her gaze. Peter tilted his head, his expression thoughtful. Trying your best isn't always enough in a place like this. Rosa paused, the weight of his words settling over her. What do you mean? He gestured vaguely with his uninjured hand, his tone soft but firm. I've been watching you, Rosa. You're talented, no doubt about that. But I've also seen how they treat you. The whispers, the looks, the way that doctor humiliated you earlier. It's not right. Rosa's chest tightened. She busied herself with adjusting his blanket, trying to hide the emotions threatening to rise to the surface. It's nothing I can't handle, she said quietly. Peter's gaze sharpened. Handling it isn't the same as addressing it. You've got skill, Rosa, but you also need strength. Not just the kind that gets you through the day, but the kind that stands up for what's right, for yourself. His words struck a chord, reverberating in the quiet space between them. Rosa hesitated, unsure of how to respond. No patient had ever spoken to her like this, so directly, so earnestly. I'm just here to do my job, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Peter leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. Your job is to care for people, but don't forget to care for yourself in the process. You can't let them chip away at you. You're better than that. For a moment, the walls Rosa had built around herself felt fragile, as though Peter's words had reached a part of her she rarely let others see. She nodded, unable to find the right words to express her gratitude. Thank you, she said softly, meeting his gaze. That means more than you know. Peter leaned back against the pillows, a small smile playing at his lips. I have a feeling about you, Rosa. You're not the type to back down. Don't prove me wrong. As she left his room, Rosa felt a strange mixture of emotions, gratitude, encouragement, and a renewed sense of resolve. Peter's words lingered in her mind, echoing louder than the doubts that had plagued her. Maybe he was right. Maybe she was stronger than she realized. Later that afternoon, Rosa walked down the hallway toward Peter Harrison's room, her clipboard tucked under her arm. As she approached, she heard muffled voices coming from inside. The door was slightly ajar, and though she hesitated, her steps slowed when she caught snippets of the conversation. I understand the urgency, Peter's voice said, firm and authoritative, a stark contrast to the patient demeanor she'd come to know. But this needs to be done carefully. The healthcare system isn't going to change overnight. Another voice responded, quieter but equally serious. Your position gives you leverage, Peter. If anyone can push this forward, it's you. Rosa's heart skipped a beat. Leverage? Push what forward? She leaned closer, straining to hear. Peter sighed audibly. I'm not doing this for recognition. This is about ensuring equity for everyone, regardless of where they come from or what they look like. If that ruffles some feathers at the top, so be it. The weight of his words settled heavily on Rosa's chest. This wasn't the casual conversation of an average patient. Her mind raced as pieces began to click into place. Peter Harrison wasn't just any VIP patient. He was someone important, someone with the power to influence change. As the conversation continued, Rosa took a cautious step back, her heart pounding. Just as she turned to leave, the door opened, and Peter's piercing blue eyes met hers. He raised an eyebrow, a knowing smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. Eavesdropping, Nurse Carter? He asked, his tone light but teasing. Rosa flushed, her voice faltering. I was just coming to check on you. Peter chuckled softly, stepping aside to let her enter. Don't worry, Rosa. I'm not upset. In fact, it might save me the trouble of explaining later. She stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. The air felt charged, as though she had stumbled upon something much bigger than herself. You're not just a patient, are you? She ventured, her voice careful. Peter's smirk widened, but his expression softened. I'm the chairman of the Equity in Healthcare Foundation, he said simply. We work to address systemic disparities in medical care. And yes, that includes places like this. Rosa's breath caught. She stared at him, the weight of his revelation sinking in. Why didn't you tell anyone? She asked, still processing what she'd heard. Peter shrugged. Sometimes it's better to observe first. You learn a lot about people when they don't know who you are. She nodded slowly, the pieces falling into place. His watchful gaze, his comments about her strength, he had been paying attention all along. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. Peter's expression turned serious, though his voice remained gentle. "Because you're part of the solution, Rosa. You've got the skill and the heart for this work, but you're also facing the same barriers I'm trying to dismantle. People like you are why I do what I do." Rosa felt a lump form in her throat. She didn't know what to say, the weight of his words pressing against her. "I don't know if I'm ready for whatever this is," she admitted. Peter smiled, a glimmer of encouragement in his eyes. "Just keep doing what you're doing. Be patient. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts with people like you. Trust me, Rosa, everything will fall into place." As she left his room, Rosa felt a strange mix of awe and determination. Peter's words echoed in her mind, the promise of change hanging in the air like a beacon. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew she wasn't alone in facing them. The next day, as Rosa checked Peter's vitals, she noticed a distant look in his eyes. He was quieter than usual, his usual sharp observations replaced by a contemplative silence. "Curious?" Rosa hesitated before speaking. "You seem different today," she ventured, keeping her tone light. "Is everything all right?" Peter glanced at her, his blue eyes softening. For a moment, he didn't respond, as if weighing whether to share what was on his mind. Finally, he sighed and leaned back against the pillows. "Have you ever felt like no matter how hard you try, the world keeps finding ways to push you down?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Rosa's chest tightened. "I think I know what you mean," she said quietly. "Why do you ask?" Peter's gaze drifted to the window, where the sunlight cast long shadows across the room. "Because I've been there. My family has been there." He paused, his jaw tightening before he continued. "My father was a brilliant man, an engineer with a mind like no other, but he was also a Black man, living in a time when that brilliance wasn't enough to earn him respect. Doors were closed, opportunities denied, all because of the color of his skin." Rosa felt her heart ache at the weight of his words. She stayed silent, letting him speak. "He never gave up, though," Peter continued, his voice tinged with both pride and pain. "He worked twice as hard as everyone else, not just for himself, but for our family. And even though he succeeded in ways that should have made the world take notice, the barriers never fully went away." Peter's hand rested on the edge of the bed, his fingers tapping lightly as he spoke. "Watching him go through that, it left a mark. It made me realize how deeply these systems are rigged against people who don't fit the mold. That's why I do what I do now. I can't erase the past, but I can fight for a future where people like my father, like you, don't have to keep proving their worth over and over again." Rosa blinked back the sting of tears, her chest swelling with a mix of empathy and admiration. "I'm sorry your family went through that," she said softly. "But it sounds like you've turned that pain into something powerful." Peter smiled faintly, a hint of gratitude in his expression. "Maybe. But the truth is, I can't do it alone. Change takes more than one person. It takes allies, people who are willing to stand up, even when it's hard." He met Rosa's gaze then, his eyes steady and full of meaning. "You've got the heart for it, Rosa. I've seen it. And if you ever feel like the world's too heavy, remember that you're not carrying it alone. You've got allies, more than you might realize." Rosa felt a lump rise in her throat, but she pushed it down, offering him a small, determined smile. "Thank you," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. "That means more than you know." As she left Peter's room, Rosa's mind swirled with his words. His story, his struggles, and his unwavering determination felt deeply personal, as though they echoed parts of her own journey. For the first time since starting at Phoenix Grace, Rosa felt a glimmer of hope. With someone like Peter Harrison as an ally, perhaps change wasn't just a dream. Perhaps it was possible. The tension in the hospital had been building like a storm waiting to break. Rosa's workload had only grown heavier, and Dr. Carterson seemed intent on testing her limits. Every interaction with him carried an undercurrent of condescension, his disdain for her thinly veiled at best. This morning was no different. Rosa was in the middle of her rounds when she was paged to the nurses' station. When she arrived, Dr. Carterson was waiting, a stack of patient files in his hand and a smug expression on his face. "Nurse Carter," he said, his voice loud enough to turn heads. "I trust you're not too overwhelmed today because I have some additional cases for you to handle." Rosa's chest tightened as he dropped the files onto the counter in front of her. There were at least 5 more patients, all with complex needs. She scanned the list, her jaw tightening as she realized the disproportionate load. "Dr. Carterson," she said carefully, "these assignments seem to be significantly more than what's been given to the others. I'm happy to do my part, but this feels excessive." He raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a mocking smile. "Are you saying you can't handle it? Perhaps I overestimated your abilities." Rosa felt the familiar sting of his words, but this time something in her snapped. She had endured enough, and she wasn't going to stand silently anymore. "I'm saying," she began, her voice firm but steady, "that this isn't about my abilities. This is about fairness. You've consistently given me more work than my colleagues, and I've taken it without complaint. But today, I'm drawing the line." A hush fell over the nurses' station as the surrounding staff turned to watch the confrontation unfold. Dr. Carterson's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of surprise before his expression hardened. "Fairness?" he scoffed, his tone dripping with disdain. "This is a hospital, not a playground. If you can't handle the workload, perhaps you're in the wrong profession." Rosa met his gaze, her own unwavering. "I'm not in the wrong profession, Dr. Carterson. I'm here because I care about my patients and because I've earned my place. But respect and fairness are not optional, even in a hospital." His face flushed, a mix of anger and embarrassment coloring his features. "How dare you speak to me like that? How dare you treat me like I'm less than everyone else here?" Rosa interrupted, her voice rising slightly. "I have worked just as hard, if not harder, than anyone else on this floor. The only difference is that I refuse to let you, or anyone else, undermine me anymore." The room was silent. Nurses and junior doctors exchanged glances, their faces a mix of shock and admiration. For the first time, Rosa saw a flicker of uncertainty in Dr. Carterson's eyes, as though he realized he had pushed too far. "You're out of line," he muttered, his voice lower now. "No, doctor," Rosa said firmly. "I'm finally in line, with myself, with my values, and with the respect I deserve." Before he could respond, the sound of a door opening drew their attention. Peter Harrison emerged from his room, leaning on a cane but standing tall. His piercing blue eyes swept over the scene, taking in the charged atmosphere. "What's going on here?" Peter asked, his voice calm but commanding. Dr. Carterson stiffened, his expression shifting to one of forced professionalism. "Nothing, Mr. Harrison. Just a minor misunderstanding." Peter's gaze flicked to Rosa, his expression softening. "Is that so?" Rosa hesitated for a moment before speaking, her voice steady. "No, Mr. Harrison, it's not." Peter nodded slowly, his sharp eyes narrowing as he turned back to Dr. Carterson. "I see." The weight of Peter's presence hung heavy in the air, and Dr. Carterson's usual arrogance seemed to waver under the scrutiny. Without another word, Peter gave Rosa a slight nod before walking away, leaving an unspoken promise lingering in the air. As Rosa watched him go, she felt a surge of quiet strength. For the first time, she had stood her ground, and while the fallout was uncertain, she felt a profound sense of liberation. Whatever came next, she was ready. The tension in the conference room was palpable as the senior leadership of Phoenix Grace gathered for an unscheduled emergency meeting. The long glass table gleamed under the overhead lights, surrounded by a mix of administrators, department heads, and the hospital board. At the center of the room stood Peter Harrison, his presence commanding even as he leaned lightly on his cane. Rosa stood quietly near the back, her heart pounding. She hadn't been told much about the meeting, but had been personally invited by Peter earlier that morning. His cryptic words still echoed in her mind, "It's time to address the truth." As the last few attendees shuffled into the room, Peter cleared his throat, silencing the low murmurs. He straightened, his piercing gaze sweeping across the room. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice calm but firm. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Harrison. I am not just a patient here at Phoenix Grace. I am the chairman of the Equity in Healthcare Foundation." A collective murmur rippled through the room. Rosa noticed several administrators shift uncomfortably in their seats, their expressions betraying varying degrees of surprise and concern. Peter raised a hand, silencing the noise. During my stay here, I've had the opportunity to observe this hospital's operations closely, closer than most patients ever get to, and what I've seen has left me deeply troubled. His gaze hardened, landing squarely on Dr. Carterson, who sat stiffly near the head of the table. I've witnessed behavior that undermines not only the values this hospital claims to uphold, but also the very foundation of patient care and employee dignity. Dr. Carterson opened his mouth, but Peter's raised hand stopped him. "Let me finish, doctor," he said sharply. "The actions I've observed, particularly from individuals in leadership positions, reflect a systemic failure, a culture that tolerates and in some cases perpetuates discrimination." Peter turned to Rosa, who felt every eye in the room suddenly on her. "Take Nurse Carter, for example," he continued, "a skilled, dedicated professional who has faced undue scrutiny, disproportionate workloads, and outright disrespect from her colleagues and superiors. Her experience is not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a larger problem." Rosa swallowed hard, her chest tightening at the public acknowledgement of her struggles. But Peter's steady, unwavering voice gave her strength. "This is unacceptable," Peter declared, his tone rising. "Hospitals like Phoenix Grace should be beacons of care, equity, and professionalism. Instead, what I've seen here is a microcosm of the systemic biases that plague healthcare nationwide." He turned his sharp gaze back to Dr. Carterson. "And you, doctor, have been at the center of much of this behavior. Your actions not only jeopardize the morale of your staff, but also compromise patient care, something I witnessed firsthand in the operating room." Dr. Carterson's face turned ashen, his mouth opening and closing as he struggled for a response. "Mr. Harrison, I assure you—" "Save it," Peter interrupted, his voice cold. "This isn't about assurances, it's about accountability." The room fell silent, the weight of Peter's words settling heavily over everyone. He turned to the board members, his expression firm. "I am calling for an immediate and thorough investigation into the culture and practices of Phoenix Grace," he said. "This includes mandatory diversity training, transparent reporting systems for staff grievances, and a complete overhaul of leadership if necessary." One of the board members, a woman with graying hair and a thoughtful expression, leaned forward. "Mr. Harrison, we appreciate your concerns, but these are serious allegations. Do you have evidence to support them?" Peter's smirk was brief but telling. "Plenty, and I'm prepared to share it all. But more importantly, I have the testimonies of staff members who have been affected, starting with Nurse Carter." Rosa's breath caught, but she met Peter's gaze, his nod giving her courage. For the first time, she felt seen, not just as a nurse doing her job, but as a person whose voice mattered. Peter stepped back, his closing words ringing out like a verdict. Phoenix Grace has a choice to make. It can continue down this path, eroding the trust and respect of its staff and patients, or it can rise to the occasion, address its failings, and become the institution it claims to be. With that, he sat down, leaving the room in stunned silence. All eyes turned to the hospital's leadership, waiting to see how they would respond. Rosa, standing at the back, felt a swell of hope mixed with uncertainty. This was only the beginning, but it was a beginning nonetheless. The conference room slowly emptied after Peter's powerful address, the air still charged with the weight of his words. Rosa lingered near the back, unsure whether to leave or approach Peter. She felt both overwhelmed and oddly empowered by the events that had just unfolded. Peter, now seated and leaning slightly on his cane, gestured for her to come closer. Rosa hesitated for a moment, then made her way to him, her footsteps quiet against the polished floor. "You were incredible in there," Rosa said softly, her voice laced with admiration. Peter gave her a small smile, one that held both pride and determination. "Thank you, Rosa. But this is just the beginning. The real work starts now." Rosa nodded, her mind racing with questions and doubts. Before she could speak, Peter leaned forward slightly, his sharp gaze meeting hers. "I want you to be a part of this," he said. "The hospital is forming a committee to overhaul its culture, and I need someone like you, someone who understands what it's like to be on the front lines of this fight." Rosa's breath hitched. "Me? I'm just a nurse. I don't know if I'm qualified for something like that." Peter chuckled, shaking his head. "Rosa, you're more than qualified. You've shown courage, integrity, and a commitment to doing what's right, even when it wasn't easy. That's exactly what this hospital needs. Rosa shifted on her feet, her heart pounding. She thought of the long hours, the emotional toll of her work, and the uphill battle she had faced every day since stepping into Phoenix Grace. The idea of taking on even more responsibility felt daunting, almost impossible. But what if I can't make a difference? She asked quietly, her doubts spilling into her voice. What if nothing really changes? Peter's expression softened, and he placed a reassuring hand on her arm. Change doesn't happen overnight, Rosa, but every step forward matters. You've already made a difference, standing up to Carterson, showing your colleagues what strength looks like. This is just the next step. Rosa swallowed hard, feeling the weight of his words. She thought of her mother's voice in her mind, reminding her of the strength she carried within her and the legacy of resilience she represented. Peter was right. She couldn't let fear stop her now. Taking a deep breath, Rosa straightened her shoulders and met his gaze. Okay, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I'll do it. Peter's smile widened, his pride evident. Good. I knew I could count on you. As Rosa left the room, the enormity of what she had just agreed to began to sink in. She didn't know what challenges lay ahead or how much resistance she would face. But one thing was clear. She wasn't alone in this fight. And for the first time, she allowed herself to believe that real change was possible. Rosa stood at the front of the brightly lit conference room, a projector displaying the words "Diversity and Inclusion Training, Building a Better Phoenix Grace" behind her. The room was filled with nurses, doctors, and administrators, their expressions ranging from curiosity to skepticism. This was Rosa's first official initiative in her new role as part of the hospital's Cultural Reform Committee, and the weight of it pressed heavily on her shoulders. Taking a deep breath, Rosa began, her voice steady but warm. Thank you all for being here today. This is the start of something important, not just for Phoenix Grace, but for each of us as individuals. Today, we're going to talk about how we work together, how we treat one another, and how we can do better for our patients and ourselves. She scanned the room, catching glimpses of varying reactions. Emily, her friend and ally, gave her a small nod of encouragement from the middle row. Claire, the senior nurse who had once been openly hostile, now sat with her arms crossed but seemed to be listening. And then there were others, like Dr. Carterson, who sat near the back, his expression unreadable, but his body language stiff. Rosa moved through the presentation, interweaving statistics with real-life examples, including her own experiences. She didn't name names, but her stories painted a clear picture of the challenges she and others had faced. I know change isn't easy, she said, her tone softening. It can be uncomfortable to confront our biases, to admit that we might have treated someone unfairly, intentionally or not. But it's only by facing these truths that we can grow. As the session progressed, Rosa noticed subtle shifts in the room. Some people leaned forward, their interest peaked. Others nodded in agreement, their skepticism softening. Still, a few remained closed off, their arms crossed or their gazes distant. When the session ended, Rosa stepped aside as the attendees filed out, murmuring quietly among themselves. Emily approached her first, a bright smile on her face. You did great, Emily said. I think you really got through to some of them. Some, Rosa echoed with a small smile. But not all, Emily shrugged. Change takes time. The important thing is you've started the conversation. As the room emptied, Rosa saw Claire lingering near the door. She hesitated, then approached, her expression guarded. I'm not going to lie, Claire began, her voice low. When they first put you in this role, I thought it was just lip service, but you're proving me wrong. Rosa blinked, surprised by the admission. Thank you, Claire. That means a lot. Claire nodded, her gaze flickering briefly before she turned and left. Rosa stood there for a moment, absorbing the small but significant victory. But not everyone was so receptive. Later that day, Rosa overheard two staff members whispering in the break room. I can't believe they're wasting time on this diversity nonsense, one of them muttered. It's all just a PR stunt. Rosa felt a pang of frustration, but reminded herself of Peter's words. Change doesn't happen overnight. This was just the beginning. As she returned to her office, Rosa reflected on the day. Some walls had started to crack, but others remained firmly in place. Still, she knew she couldn't let the resistance deter her. She had a vision for a better Phoenix Grace, and she was determined to see it through, one step at a time. The buzz started small. A local news outlet picked up the story of the reforms at Phoenix Grace Hospital, highlighting Rosa's role in driving change. But soon the narrative grew. By the end of the week, national media had caught wind of the story, framing it as an inspiring tale of resilience and justice in the face of systemic inequities. Latina nurse fights discrimination, sparks cultural revolution at prestigious hospital, one headline read. Another proclaimed, Chairman and nurse unite to combat bias in healthcare. Rosa was stunned by the attention. She had barely adjusted to her new responsibilities when the first interview requests began pouring in. At first, she was hesitant, unsure if she was ready to speak about her experiences on such a large platform. But Peter, ever the mentor, encouraged her to embrace the opportunity. "This isn't just about you, Rosa," he said during one of their meetings. "Your story is a symbol for so many others who have faced similar challenges. Use your voice. Let it resonate." With his encouragement, Rosa agreed to her first major interview. Sitting under the bright studio lights, she felt a wave of nerves as the host introduced her. But as the questions began, Rosa found her footing, her words flowing with honesty and passion. "It wasn't easy," she admitted when asked about her experiences. "There were days I wanted to give up, but I kept reminding myself that change doesn't come without effort, and that by staying silent, I'd be part of the problem instead of the solution." The interview went viral, sparking discussions across social media and within the healthcare industry. Comments poured in from people around the world, nurses sharing their own stories of discrimination, patients praising Rosa's courage, and leaders calling for similar reforms in their institutions. Shortly after, Rosa was invited to speak at a national healthcare conference. Standing on a stage in front of hundreds of professionals, she felt the weight of the moment. Peter had joined her for moral support, his presence in the audience grounding her. "I used to think my job was just about helping patients," Rosa told the crowd. "But I've realized it's about so much more. It's about creating an environment where every patient and every healthcare worker is treated with the dignity and respect they deserve." Her speech was met with a standing ovation, and afterward, attendees flooded her with questions, ideas, and messages of support. Hospitals from across the country reached out, seeking advice on implementing their own cultural reform initiatives. Back at Phoenix Grace, the ripple effects were undeniable. Staff who had once dismissed Rosa's efforts began to recognize the broader significance of her work. Emily often joked, "We've got a celebrity in our midst." But the truth was, Rosa remained focused on her mission. In quiet moments, Rosa still felt the weight of imposter syndrome creeping in. Was she really the right person for this? Could she live up to the expectations people now placed on her? But then she'd think of Peter's unwavering faith in her, the patient she had cared for, and the colleagues who had started to believe in the possibility of change. Slowly but surely, Rosa was beginning to believe in herself too. As she prepared for yet another event, Rosa looked at the speech she had written and smiled. This wasn't just her story anymore. It was the story of countless others who had faced adversity and dared to dream of a better future. The day had been long, filled with meetings, interviews, and planning sessions. By the time Rosa finally sat down in her modest apartment, she was exhausted, but not defeated. The glow of her laptop illuminated her face as she scrolled through emails, one catching her attention immediately. Subject: "Always proud of you, mi amor." Sender: "Mom." Rosa opened it, her lips curving into a smile as she read the heartfelt message. "Rosa, you're doing incredible things I always knew you were capable of. I see the stories about you, hear your name mentioned by people in our community, and my heart swells with pride. Never forget where you come from or the strength of those who came before you. You are my shining star, and I love you so much. Love, Mama." Tears welled in Rosa's eyes. Her mother's words wrapped around her like a warm blanket, reminding her of the unshakable foundation that had carried her through her darkest moments. Picking up her phone, she dialed her mother's number, and the familiar, soothing voice answered almost immediately. "Mama," Rosa said softly, her voice catching in her throat, "I couldn't have done any of this without you." Her mother chuckled, her warmth palpable even through the phone. "No, mijija, you had it in you all along. I just helped you see it. They talked for a while, her mother sharing anecdotes from the family and memories of Rosa's childhood. By the time the call ended, Rosa felt lighter, her resolve fortified. The next day at work, Rosa entered the break room and found Emily waiting for her with 2 steaming cups of coffee. Her friend had become a pillar of support in recent weeks, and Rosa was grateful for their growing bond. "Thought you could use this," Emily said, handing her a cup. "You've been running yourself ragged." Rosa accepted it with a smile. "Thanks, Emily, and thanks for everything else. You've been amazing through all of this." Emily shrugged, a playful grin on her face. "Hey, somebody's got to keep you sane. Plus, you've inspired me. If you can take on the whole hospital in the national spotlight, I can handle a few grumpy patients." They sat together, sipping their coffee and chatting about the day ahead. Emily's presence was a comforting reminder that Rosa wasn't alone. The friendship that had started in shared frustration had blossomed into a genuine partnership, one grounded in mutual respect and understanding. As they left the break room, Rosa glanced at Emily, her heart swelling with gratitude. "You know," Rosa said, "I couldn't have done this without you either." Emily smirked. "Don't get all sappy on me now, Carter. You've got speeches to write and lives to change." Rosa laughed, feeling the heaviness of the past weeks lift, if only for a moment. Between her mother's unwavering love and Emily's steadfast friendship, Rosa realized she had a network of strength to lean on. It wasn't just her fight anymore. It was a collective effort fueled by the people who believed in her. And for the first time in a long time, Rosa truly believed in herself too. The sunlight streamed through the large glass windows of Phoenix Grace Hospital, casting a warm glow over the bustling main lobby. Rosa stood near the front desk, watching as nurses and doctors moved with a sense of collaboration and purpose she had once only dreamed of. The hospital felt different now. More open, more alive, more unified. Gone were the whispered conversations that stopped when she walked by, replaced by warm greetings and genuine exchanges. The posters in the hallway reflected the hospital's new mission. Diversity is strength, compassion is key. Training sessions on equity and inclusion had become a regular fixture, and feedback from patients and staff alike painted a picture of transformation. Phoenix Grace was no longer just a hospital. It was a symbol of change. Rosa's phone buzzed in her pocket, and she glanced down to see an email from the National Healthcare Association. They were inviting her to present at another conference, this time on systemic reform and the role of leadership in fostering inclusion. She smiled to herself, her heart swelling with pride. It was hard to believe how far she had come, from the nervous young nurse stepping into an unwelcoming environment to a leader inspiring change across the industry. But Rosa knew the journey wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had faced barriers and discrimination in silence. Peter Harrison appeared at her side, his cane tapping lightly on the floor. He looked healthier now, his recovery nearly complete. "Taking it all in?" he asked, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. Rosa nodded, her gaze sweeping the lobby. "It's hard to believe sometimes," she admitted, "but seeing it now, it feels worth it." Peter smiled, his eyes twinkling with pride. "You've done more than most people accomplish in a lifetime, Rosa. Phoenix Grace is a testament to what can happen when someone refuses to back down." Rosa turned to him, a mixture of gratitude and determination in her eyes. "I couldn't have done it without you. You saw something in me when I wasn't sure it was there." Peter chuckled. "I didn't see something that wasn't there. I just reminded you of what you already had." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the flow of activity around them. Patients laughed with nurses, doctors worked side by side with respect and camaraderie, and the walls that had once felt cold and unwelcoming now radiated hope. "But you know," Peter said, breaking the silence, "this isn't the end. The fight doesn't stop here." Rosa nodded. "I know, there's still so much to do, not just here, but everywhere." Peter patted her shoulder. "And you're the perfect person to lead that charge." As he walked away, Rosa took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his words settle over her. But instead of fear, she felt a steady resolve. She had faced so much, overcome countless obstacles, and emerged stronger for it. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready. Rosa stepped forward, heading toward her next meeting, her heart full of purpose. The journey had been long and hard, but she wasn't walking it alone anymore. Phoenix Grace was just the beginning, and she was determined to carry its lessons far and wide. As the doors of the hospital lobby closed behind her, Rosa felt a quiet sense of triumph. This wasn't just a chapter ending. It was the beginning of a new story, one where hope, resilience, and justice would lead the way. A few days after the hospital's latest diversity initiative launch, Rosa found an envelope on her desk. Her name was written in elegant cursive, and though there was no return address, she immediately recognized the neat handwriting. It was from Peter Harrison. Sitting down, Rosa carefully opened the envelope, her fingers brushing against the thick paper inside. She unfolded the letter, her breath hitching as she began to read. Dear Rosa, by the time you read this, I will have left Phoenix Grace, but I couldn't go without leaving you this note. Watching you over the past few months has been one of the most inspiring experiences of my life. Your courage, resilience, and unwavering dedication to doing what's right have left a mark, not just on this hospital, but on me as well. You've done something extraordinary here, Rosa. You've turned the tide in a place that desperately needed change. But I want you to remember something. This is just the beginning. The road ahead won't be easy. There will be those who resist, who try to pull you down or undermine the progress you've made. But I have no doubt that you'll rise above them, just as you always have. You're not just a nurse or a leader, you're a force for change. And the world needs more people like you, people who are willing to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard. I'll be watching from afar, cheering you on. And whenever you doubt yourself, remember this: you've already changed lives. You've already made a difference. And I know you'll continue to do so. Thank you for reminding me of what true leadership looks like. You've given me hope, Rosa. Hope that the world can become a better, fairer place, one step at a time. With deepest respect and admiration, Peter Harrison. Rosa held the letter in her hands, her vision blurring as tears welled up in her eyes. Peter's words settled deep in her heart, resonating with a truth she hadn't fully allowed herself to acknowledge. She had made a difference. And she wasn't done yet. Carefully folding the letter, Rosa placed it back into its envelope and tucked it into her bag. She sat quietly for a moment, letting the emotions wash over her: pride, gratitude, and determination. She thought about the patients who would benefit from the changes she had helped implement, about the nurses and doctors who had started to see each other differently, and about the countless individuals who still faced the same struggles she once had. Taking a deep breath, Rosa stood, her resolve as firm as ever. Peter was right. This was only the beginning. She had a long way to go, but she wasn't afraid. She had her mother's wisdom, Peter's encouragement, and her own unshakable belief in the power of compassion and justice to guide her. Looking out the window at the bustling city beyond, Rosa whispered a promise to herself: I'll keep fighting, for all of us. And with that, she turned back to her work, ready to take the next step in her journey. The morning sun bathed the front entrance of Phoenix Grace Hospital in a soft golden light. Rosa stood outside, taking in the familiar sight of the revolving doors that she had walked through so many times before. But today felt different. Today, she was different. Her reflection in the glass caught her eye. She saw not the hesitant, unsure nurse who had walked in on her first day, but someone stronger. Someone who had fought, persevered, and changed not only herself, but the very fabric of the hospital. Rosa adjusted her bag on her shoulder and straightened her posture, letting a smile spread across her face. The warm air carried the sounds of the city waking up: car horns, distant chatter, and the steady rhythm of her own heartbeat. It was a new day, and she was ready. As she stepped through the doors, familiar faces greeted her. Emily waved from the front desk, a bright smile lighting up her face. Dr. Patel nodded as he passed, a subtle but genuine acknowledgement that hadn't existed before. Even Claire, the once cold senior nurse, offered a small but sincere, "Good morning, Rosa." The hospital hummed with activity, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was an openness now, a sense of unity that hadn't been there months ago. It wasn't perfect. There were still challenges to face, attitudes to shift, and battles to fight, but the progress was undeniable. Rosa walked through the halls, her footsteps purposeful. Each step felt like a commitment to her patients, her colleagues, and the vision of a better, more inclusive healthcare system. She passed the mural near the main lobby, the one depicting a diverse group of healthcare workers united in their mission. Beneath it, the words gleamed in bold lettering: "Diversity is strength. Compassion is our calling." She paused for a moment, running her fingers along the cool surface of the plaque. The mural wasn't just a symbol of what they had achieved. It was a reminder of what still lay ahead. A nurse rushed past her, clipboard in hand, and Rosa heard her name called over the intercom. Smiling to herself, she turned and made her way toward her next task. The hospital was alive, and so was she. Alive with purpose, hope, and the unshakable belief that she could face whatever challenges came her way. As she moved forward, Rosa's mind was already buzzing with ideas, plans, and dreams for the future. She didn't know exactly what lay ahead, but she welcomed it with open arms. The journey wasn't over. It had only just begun. With her head held high and her heart full, Rosa Carter stepped into the day, ready to make a difference all over again. Thank you for watching this inspiring story of resilience and change. If this touched your heart or gave you hope, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring more stories like Rosa's to life, shedding light on the struggles and triumphs of those making a difference in the world. What part of Rosa's journey inspired you the most? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And remember, together, we can create a more compassionate, inclusive world, one story at a time. Thank you for being a part of this journey.